ultimately relate to different types of outcomes. It's critical for providers and service organizations to understand which assumptions drive their actions and which assumptions limit their actions. We've seen that some organizations don't look back at themselves to see that these assumptions create lenses that frame different responses. Even with good language like person-centered can appear in more restrictive settings and be expressed more restrictively because the assumptions have not been identified and the actions have not been identified. Therefore, person-centered lays on the surface as language that does not go deeply into the relationship. So let's take a look at how those assumptions play out. So one assumption that we know still operate in our world dominated most of the service system up into the recent past. The people with disabilities are both tragic and sources of pity, and they're also vulnerable. Part of this is accurate, but as a total picture of a person, it will drive a particular response that doesn't attend to a whole person. We create institutions and special institutions when we see people exclusively as tragic and vulnerable. We think that they need to have their own particular place. This has been the dominant response for many, many years. And it results in some outcomes, but they're not total human outcomes. For example, we get personal care, we get activities, we might get a roof over our head. But these are the primary pieces of this particular type of orientation. We also know that this narrow approach has not been successful. Over the years, it has become abusive and dysfunctional and has created a shift and a need for a shift to a different perspective of a person. So we've opened our mind over the years to the possibility that people with disabilities are consumers with clinical needs. We become more professionalized, we retain the specialized orientation, but we bring in a different quality, a more sophisticated sense of evidence-based practices and hopefully best practices in terms of a clinical sense. And our response to that is that we now are breaking up services from being in one container, housing, activity, personal care, all in one place, to being spread out into group homes or workshops or day programs and other types of clinical services. So now our responses break up and coordinate. And what we get from that mostly is about a plan of coordinated care with appropriate levels of service, and hopefully people are more satisfied with our responses to this. We still don't see from these situations that are focused around care the more integrated responses. Those don't show up until our shifts move away from simply clinical needs or deficits to seeing people with disabilities as individuals with capacities and gifts. This changes our response, and this is where really person-centered supports show up. This is where we shift from a care orientation, which is basically a hierarchical relationship between the provider and the person who receives services, to a partnership, more partnership arrangements. Here we're interested in gathering people together that care about the person, and they can act as allies and bridge builders to the community. And then we begin to see the creation of individualized supports leading to a home and relationship. Lastly, we see this orientation happen. We can see this at the UN Bill of Rights for people with disabilities. And we're now interested in them being shoulder to shoulder with all of us in the community. They're being perceived as people who need to be attended to and connected to, not as part of a specialized program. No need for bridges into the community or allies, although we all need them on some level. It's needed. It's not needed because our communities have shifted. We have moved the margins of the community further out to include people that have disability and difference. And therefore, community resources becomes the option, the dominant option, with the other responses, both from institutional to care coordination to person-centered support, becoming ancillary to the community resources because the community has assumed responsibility. This is more a vision for the future, or the road that we hopefully are in the evolution of how we view people with disabilities and how we respond to them. Now we see the emphasis in terms of outcomes on valued roles or life of distinction. This has manifested itself in clearly 4 primary forms that DD services have assumed over the years, and in many ways, services for other people as well that do not have the developmental disabilities label. We can now say that there's a institutional care orientation. You can see the box representing that, the red. You can see that there's a more hierarchical, coordinated care or managed care orientation, that is a distinctive approach. And we see the sort of person-centered supports. I label them as integrative. The circle represents the circle of support around the person. And then the star represents sort of the North Star of where we would like to be with people of difference, that they're no longer marginalized but part of our community. And you can see the color is now blue, as I thought about blue space, fully blue, the whole thing. This is a progression. We do know that we are straddling these different ways of looking and relating to people, and that is often confusing. The language from one gets utilized really in an area of another. The thought here is to be aware of where our service orientation is now if we're interested in meeting the requirements of the HCBS final rule. That gives us a sense of how far we must travel in our destination to meet the rule. So if we start, because most of our services are relating to institutional care, we have a pretty long way to go to transform what we do in terms of supporting people. It's also, the assumption is also that the support models on the right are more aligned with realizing the community rule than what we see in the care models. But the care models are so restrictive in terms of their ingredients and factors that make them hum, so to speak, that it really is sort of wrestling or struggling upstream against the current. Then in the other areas, the other support model, which can actually have enough blue space to create something new and different that supports the objectives that we have in the community